Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without words and never stops at all. Who's heard that poem from Emily Dickinson? Poem by one of the great American poets expressing something profoundly human about our experience. Hope is the tiny feathers, a tiny featherer bird perched somewhere deep inside each of us, singing relentlessly despite a world that would silence its song. And if we don't think about it much, this thing with feathers is actually essential to us all. Or as Dostoevsky once wrote, to live without hope is to cease to live. Now, I don't know about you, but it's hard to hear that wordless tune of hope these days. The continual barrage of headlines, tweets, news makes hope's tune hard to hear. Between wars and conflicts and dysfunctional politics, one can struggle to hold on to that thing with feathers that perches in our souls. The reality of climate change is no longer some concept far into the future, but here today with forest fires and record heat waves and oceans growing warmer and warmer. So much so that we can no longer know how to prevent climate change. Instead, the question is, how do we mitigate its effects? So if hope is a thing with feathers, it is sadly symbolic that now scientists estimate since 1970, the number of birds in North America has declined by nearly 3 billion. A 29% loss of the abundance, and that trend is worldwide. Now, I don't know if it's because I'm getting older. I don't know if it's because of the birth of my first grandchild, but I find myself quite honestly wrestling with hope. Quite wrestling with the hope, or listening for that tune of hope without words. And I find myself wrestling with questions of what kind of world am I leaving to my children, to my grandchildren? What challenges, I find myself asking, what challenges they will face as they grow up in this strange new world we have made. And actually, I find myself less worried about the books they might read in our local library and more concerned about how to make the world more just and peaceful and life-giving. Yet, despite these dispiriting worries, I find Emily Dickinson's words profound and inspiring. Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings a tune without words and never stops at all. Hope never stops. I have to be reminded of that sometimes because hope's song never stops. It will sing until I join in myself. Now, this passage from Isaiah we read this morning is about the unending song of hope. The Judean people have been sent into exile, a foreign land, uprooted, everything they knew taken from them. The future is very dark. They struggle with hope. They are defeated and have lost everything that gave meaning to their lives, and they worry about their children and their grandchildren, what will happen to them. And the prophet Isaiah sings them a song about hope, about possibility. The passage we read this morning, actually scholars call this the first of what are called servant songs. He's singing to a people lost in despair and exile and without hope, and his song expresses something radical about hope, that the God who made them, the God who loves them, a God who delights in them even now. And so God just doesn't give them hope. God, through the prophet Isaiah, tries to remind them that they are the embodiment of hope, that they are the servants of hope. As the line goes in the passage, thus the God, the Lord who created the heavens and earth, who stretched them out, who spread out the earth and what comes from it, who gives breath to the people upon it and spirit to those who walk on it, this great God who says, I am the Lord, and says, I've called you to righteousness. I've taken you by the hand and kept you. It's important words when we feel despairing and hopeless. But then it gets pushed even further. I have given you to be a covenant to the people. I have given you to be a light to the nations. Here he's talking to a people lost in despair, having lost everything, and God is telling him, the prophet Isaiah, you are the light to the nations. To open the eyes of the blind, to bring out the prisoners from the dungeon, from the darkness, the prison of those who sit in darkness. You are the hope. Now you may recognize those words because that actually was the first words of Jesus in his first sermon he ever gave. He quoted this text. The early followers of Jesus saw in these words, this servant song, a reflection of Jesus as the servant who will not grow faint, as a servant who will not be crushed, as a servant who will do God's justice and love as it reigns in the world. And in a meaningful way, it may be hard to imagine, but in a meaningful way, it is our calling as the church to be servants of hope, to be that thing with feathers that perches in the soul of the world and sings and never stops at all. That feels overwhelming. The servant song was meant for the lost Israelites, and it's meant for us this morning. It's a reminder each and every Sunday that our very God who made us and the creation around us delights in us and calls us to be servants of hope. I have given you, God says to us, as a covenant to the people, a light to all nations. This week in Vacation Bible School, we taught our children about God's love for them, and it was showed in the many volunteers and the people who cared for them and walked them from class to class. And we taught them about God's creation, how God gave us this beautiful creation, and how God calls us to care for that creation as we love and care for our neighbors. And so we pass along to them in those days we had with them, we pass along to them this calling, this reminder of who they will be, to be a servant of hope for all creation. We taught them to sing the hope that never stops. I was struck by this recently in thinking about this, of that song of hope that perches in our soul this morning, and I hope it's not unfair to point to them this morning, the experience of the refugee and immigrant families who worship with us. Here are families that left everything behind except what they could carry. They come to a foreign land where they don't know a language with only the things they could carry. And they come in hope to make a better world for themselves, for their kids, for their grandkids. They are a reminder as much as I might feel lost in despair, an embodiment of the power of hope. Let us go forth and be servants of hope in a world that needs it so badly. To God be the glory this day and forevermore.